guys, I'm Drago and I've been thinking. A few days ago we got our first look at the FNAF 2 movie, that being just a contest for winning tickets to the premiere, but still it's a look. We get to see this colour scheme they've got going on here, you know, this green and blue, that's quite nice. But this post got me thinking, what will Springtrap look like in the movie? Because obviously if you don't know, and spoilers ahead I guess if you haven't seen it for some reason, William Afton does come a lot in the first movie, he does get spin locked. So we know Springtrap is coming along at some point.
I always come back.
And obviously Spin Bonnie in the movie looks quite different to Spin Bonnie in the games. So the question is, how is Springtrap going to look in the movie? Because he's going to probably look quite different compared to what he looks like in FNAF 3 and so on. So I thought today it might be fun to try and design what I think a movie Springtrap might look like. And I'm taking you on that design journey with me. So sit back and enjoy. So I actually find movie Spin Bonnie to be one of the hardest animatronics to draw for me. Something about his shapes just feels so weird and unnatural. And that's probably because I'm so used to drawing Spin Bonnie in a certain way. And that's more like how we see him in the games. And that actually is a really different way of drawing Spin Bonnie. The game Spin Bonnie's muzzle is like a lot smoother, a lot more curved. Movie Spin Bonnie's muzzle has a lot of a harder edge to it. It doesn't really curve into the face, it just sits on top of it. And then you've got a very different head shape, very different eye shape. The ears are sort of rounder. He's got a bit of a bulkier body and how his shoulders lie and stuff. Very different jaw shape as well. So I find drawing him actually quite difficult because I've not done it so often and I'm not so used to his shapes. And so in these construction lines, I was being so picky about it. I wanted to make sure he actually looked like movie Spin Bonnie. And so I was being so picky about the proportions and things. Basically, I was being overly perfectionist about it. I did a lot of adjustments, a lot of redrawing things. I ended up having to accept that it's going to look weird until everything comes together and then it'll look okay. Because especially like the shape and size of the head, it just looks so weird. And so I put the ears on it and I was like, okay, no, this is the right size and shape. But anyways, of course, I was going for a more Springtrap-esque pose. So I had him sort of leaning in a more pained stance, a little bit more floppy, not holding himself up properly. I wanted to have one arm sort of brought up, but the hand is sort of hanging a bit uselessly, while the other arm has the hand reaching out towards you in that classic Springtrap pose. During the refined sketch is where I actually brought in a reference of Springtrap from FNAF 3. I wanted to match up the withering that was already on Spin Bonnie seen in the movie with the withering seen on Springtrap. So any withering that was already there from the movie, that is probably now going to be even more withered, even more exaggerated, larger holes and such, it's just worn away even more now. So those withering patterns are made larger, and then on the parts that weren't withered to start off with, I added a little bit of withering in the same sort of patterns as Springtrap from FNAF 3 to show the further decay of the suit. Now thinking about it, I don't think it's going to be a 30-year time gap in the movie. Matthew Lillard, who plays William Afton, has been signed for 3 contracts, indicating that he is in some capacity going to be in the second movie. Obviously we don't know if they're going to be saving Springtrap for the third one, or if he's just going to be a post-credit teaser in the second film, or if he's actually going to be part of the story in the second film, we don't know. But if he is going to be part of the story in the second film, then I think it's going to be closer to like a 1, 2 or 3 year time gap. A bit more like how the Silver Eyes trilogy had it. So I didn't want it to be as decayed as Springtrap is, because Springtrap is a 30 years level of decay, whereas here we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 years level of decay. Though I just still add a decent amount of withering to the suit, because if you think about the conditions and sort of the decay process, how many probably bugs and stuff are there, the fluids leaking out, which sounds disgusting, but it's an actual process. But the fluids and stuff leaking into the suit, making it mold, having it eaten away, the suit will decay substantially in that amount of time. The main difference will be how much a human corpse is decayed. So we are not looking at this sort of dried up, mummified, almost like half corpse seen on Springtrap in the games. We're going to be looking at a bit fresher, a bit more of a full corpse, probably with some bone exposed but still some flesh left over, things like that. With that in mind, there is a lot of areas where the human corpse had to be visible. This is in contrast to FNAF 3 Springtrap, where you don't see actually a lot of the human corpse. But here, the human corpse is going to be very sort of visible, especially around the neck area. So I had to really think about how that was going to look. And I did have a reference open for this. I had to open it on a completely separate window that isn't in the recording. And this is because it's a picture of a corpse. I mean, it's a corpse from a video game, it's a 3D model, but still, I don't think YouTube would like it, so I'm not showing it. But I do have a reference open here for an idea of how I think he might look inside. I also left some clothes on him because I did Google and clothes can take up to 5 years to decay depending on the material. So I reckon he still has scraps of clothing left over there, especially since a lot of clothing is synthetic. I also had to think about where the endoskeleton would go. It's kind of hard to do that when you look at movie Spin Bonnie. We haven't really seen much of his endoskeleton. So I went with the idea of making the spin locks visible. The spin locks being those prawns that we see in the movie that dig into his stomach. I added a lot more of those, had it that they'd just dig it into his body to show how the spin lock failure went off. And then on the arms and legs, I added those rings and bars that Springtrap has. If you look at Springtrap's endoskeleton, there are rings of metal connected by bars that run down the legs and arms. It sort of holds the structure of the legs and arms, and I imagine that the human arm or leg would probably slip into those. So I added those to add a bit more of the endoskeleton being visible and allude more to it having, you know, come in and crushed into William. As for the line art, when I'm doing something more detailed like a Springtrap design, I like to keep a thinner line art. This gives me more room to add the detail, because if I have a thicker line art, then I'm taking up more space with each line. A thinner line means that I can have small gaps and stuff that I can then exaggerate in the colouring. But as I always say, line weight variation is important. It's the best way to make your line art pop out and not look as flat. So even though I'm using a really thin brush, I do go back over areas just to add a little bit more weight, mainly in areas that are quite solid or are going to have a lot of shadow, stuff like that. coloring him, I didn't want to make him as green as Springtrap looks. Again, this is going back to the idea that it's probably not going to be a 30-year time gap. The suit hasn't decayed as much, it hasn't moulded as much, there's not as much grime and dirt and mould on it. The sort of things that make Springtrap the greener colour that he is. So I decided to take the original colours of the suit and just sort of dull them down a bit, make them look a bit grungier but not like completely caked in grime and dirt. Because I doubt a couple of years is long enough to get to the major discoloration seen in FNAF 3 Springtrap. So every original colour of Swim Bonnie from the movie I just dulled down, desaturated. As for the corpse, the base colour I chose is just a placeholder. There's going to be a lot more tones and colours in it when it comes to the texturing. We're back at it again with my trusty watercolour brush. My god, I love this thing. It's just, Paint Tool Side 2 has such a nice watercolour brush to use. I love it. I fiddled around with some colours for a while and then decided to go to my airbrush quickly and just put an overall texture over all of it. Just add a little bit of what would be known as a bump map in a 3D model. Just gives it that 3D texture to it a little bit more. And then I went in with a more refined texture and using the watercolour brush, which I put on a blocks and noise texture. As usual, this is just defining the shapes of each part, showing the parts that stick out a bit more, showing the parts that are cracks, and just give everything that 3D look. And honestly, a comment that I get a lot on my art when I post it is that people think it's actually a 3D render, which is honestly mind-blowing to me. That's a massive compliment. But it's doing this texturing that makes people think that. It's doing this texturing and really exaggerating those 3D shapes that make people think that it's actually a 3D render. So if you want your art to pop out more, not look as flat, then spend some time sitting down and learning to paint in textures and stuff. It took me a while to learn and for it to become a natural process, but you'll get there with it eventually. And it really just brings it another level to your art. Now again, I had the reference of the 3D model of the corpse up on a different window. I also had it open in a different canvas so I could colour pick from it, which is the little p1.jpg down at the bottom there. Again, not showing it on the recording because YouTube will not like it. But basically, the image I found for reference, which is a 3D model asset used for games, it was like the perfect depiction of what I think William Afton's corpse should look like inside a Springtrap. It was the perfect mixture of exposed bone where the flesh is properly rotted away and actual rotted flesh that's still there. It also really showed off the muscle structures in the body, especially on the neck, which is like the most visible part of this design. And it just really made it look like so good. Like, this is what I wish William Afton looked like inside a Springtrap in FNAF 3. This would be so cool. To make this effect, I use a mixture of sort of off-whites to make the bone colours, as well as adding some greens in areas to show the sort of rottenness, and some purple to show blood pooling and bruising. On the metal parts shown, I did some rough texturing on them, but I also added a rust overlay on them. You know, blood is going to go all over those. It's going to oxidise the metal, and that metal is going to rust. Just adds another layer of age and wear to it. At the very end of the texturing phase, I added just some little bits of blood here and there, mainly on the joints of the suits where blood would have seeped out. And of course I stained his clothes with blood. There's a lot more visible stains on the clothes, especially where he has been stabbed into. And the final thing to do was a few extra shading layers, just to separate areas where it was needed and make other areas pop a bit more. I did a mixture of some really rough shading that was quite soft, and then just a very, very rough layer of a bit harder shading. This just helps define everything a bit more, make everything a bit sharper, and really make sure each part stands out from each other and is readable. And there we have it. My take on what Springtrap might look like in the upcoming FNAF movies. Honestly, I'm really happy with how it's turned out. I really like this design. I'm also very happy with how the texturing looks. I think it just looks great. I'm proud of how the corpse looks because I thought I'd struggle with that. I think this is plenty grotesque enough to live up to being Springtrap. Although we know that the second movie is going to be PG-13 again, so the design for Springtrap is probably not going to be this gruesome, but one could dream. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, maybe leave a like and subscribe. I'd really, really appreciate it. Hit the bell to turn on notifications and know when I next upload, and I will see all of you in the next video. Bye!